All right, great. My name is 𝐏𝐫𝐤𝐚𝐳. I'm the founder and the head of school for Lafayette Academy. We are a private school here in Wentzville, and we serve our students kindergarten through 12th grade, and we partner with Hillsdale College. We license our curriculum from them. I think we're probably on our 7th year now with that, 8th year in existence, and 7th year with Hillsdale's licensed curriculum. And we're just so grateful and excited for all the goodness. We have over 37 new students this year. We're over 100 students. We have some of the highest test scores in St. Charles County. Well, the highest test scores in St. Charles County, maybe in the state. And things just continue to grow, and our kids are so blessed. And one of the biggest reasons they're blessed is because they have great teachers like our teacher tonight, Mr. Preston. Briefly, I founded this school 9 years ago, born out of a renewed love for our country and its historical roots. My husband and I wanted our children to gain a deep knowledge and an appreciation for our nation's founding, but I realized as we homeschooled and did that with them, why stop there? It was so much fun. So we had to do it for more kids. So in 2017, we started Lafayette Academy with just 9 students, and now today we're at about 102. Tonight's talk is part of an ongoing series exploring historical events and cultural ideologies. This program began in response to parents requesting that they want the same education their kids were getting. It just happened again this week. We had another family come through and they said, okay, we're gonna put our girl in 1st grade, but what about me? So through this series that we began with Mr. Preston, we offer a glimpse of what our kids learn in the classroom, but with a deeper dive tailored to our more experienced audience. So what we teach here is truly transformative for every child who walks through our halls. The need for classical education grounded in moral principles has never been more urgent than it is today. Our nation was built on these ideals, and its future, I believe, depends on educating citizens who are deeply rooted in those principles, which dovetails nicely into our topic for tonight. Mr. Preston's passion for our right to free expression was ignited when he decided to change careers and pursue a master's in teaching history. While studying at Webster University, he took courses on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And from a long time history teacher who had spent over 30 years teaching in the Clayton High School. Immersed in his master's study, Mr. Preston dove deep into the Bill of Rights, which led him to a crucial realization. These documents do not grant us the freedoms, but instead they protect us from government infringement on those freedoms. This insight transformed his understanding of our republic. His presentation tonight is going to examine the rich history of those protections, which predate our nation's founding in 1776, and he's going to address then the modern threats that are trying to attack those freedoms today. Please help me welcome our gem, Mr. Keith Preston.
Thank you, Mrs. McKinney. All right, take my chair here. Yes, this is the Bill of Rights chair here at Lafayette Academy. So, I'm excited with this subject. I'm excited to have you all here. I know a number of you are online, and I hope you will enjoy this presentation as well. I'll try to take our time here so that you get an understanding of the events and the principles involved. I have a lot of slides here, and I may at some point in time move through a couple of them quicker than others, but I think you'll enjoy what we have to share tonight. So you can see from the screen, hopefully, that this is a painted scene of the famous Boston Tea Party that happened in the 1770s and actually was a key moment in starting the revolution, the American Revolution. But more than anything, the British response to this event is the reason you have the Bill of Rights that you have today, to make sure that a government can never do what was done in the wake of this particular event. And we will get to that specifically in a certain slide. I'll talk about what the British government called the Coercive Acts. Isn't that British for you? Well, we're just trying to coerce them into doing the right thing as opposed to punishment, and which the Bostonians decided to call the Intolerable Acts. So we'll get to that in a little bit. All right. First of all, it's really good to remember that at the time when the colonists were here in North America, they were very proud to be part of the greatest empire in the world at that time. The English had defeated the Spanish Armada. Spain was on the downswing. France, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, although I do spend a lot of time with my kids in my classes talking about why New France never really took off here, and the British colonies did. But one of the things that they all knew is they knew they had certain rights as Englishmen. And these were the result of what is known as the English Bill of Rights, which were created in the wake of the what's called the Glorious Revolution, which is when finally the Stuart kings were thrown out. They had the first Stuart king was James I. Some of you may know of him. The King James Bible was written by people at his time. That's why it's called that. He's Elizabeth's cousin. And when Charles I became king, there became a conflict between the king and the parliament. They went to war. It's known as the English Civil War. And the winner of the English Civil War was the Parliament, and the loser was King Charles I, who lost his head. He was beheaded because he had committed treason in the view of Parliament by going to war against the people through their Parliament. And so after that happened was what we call the British Restoration, the restoration of the crown, Charles II, and then James II, who comes in after that. And James II was going to try to, as far as Parliament concerned, turn things back to the old ways under Charles I, which meant more of an absolute rule, more of a divine right of kings, and possibly turn to Catholicism, which by then, ever since Henry VIII, England had rejected. So when they got the word out that James was going to get the same treatment Charles I does, James was smarter than Charles I, and rather than trying to go to war with Parliament, he ran away to France. And that's known as the Glorious Revolution. And so at that time, they're saying, well, we still need a king. So they brought in William and Mary, William of Orange and his wife Mary, who was British. And they said, please come back and be our king, but we want new rules. We want protections of our rights. And so that's when the English Bill of Rights comes up. So James II flees, and the rights of all Englishmen are seen to have certain basic rights, which today we kind of take for granted. So the British American colonists who were living over in America while all this is going on saw this as a right that they have as Englishmen, even though they're living in the colonies, they're full English British citizens. And when we get to the American Revolution, one of the main reasons it happens is because they come to the realization that they're not being treated as full British citizens. They're being treated as second-class citizens. And so for that reason, you begin to have the American Revolution. So what kind of rights are we talking about? Freedom of speech and debates. The freedom to petition your government for a redress of grievances, which is actually part of our First Amendment rights here. It comes from the English Bill of Rights. Part of a gradual rejection of this idea of absolutism. That's why when you hear the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's language is all about the king has done this and the king has done that because it's a rejection of an absolute monarchy. But in reality, most of those things they're protesting are not the king, they're the Parliament by this point in time. But it's a lot easier to put it on the king than it is to put on a diffuse body of elected officials. And so that's what's going to happen. Now, one of the first major protests in the colonies actually predates some of the stuff that we're talking about. There's some little known thing that's called Bacon's Rebellion, which happens in Virginia. For a long period of time in the 1600s, the easiest way to get to the New World, especially for people who didn't have money, was what we call indentured servitude. You would sign a contract back in England. Somebody needs, a blacksmith or somebody to run, the farm, or somebody who's good with horses or whatever skill. Maybe you need maids. Maybe you need servants. And so you would sign an indenture which says, for the next 7 years, I'm indentured to a specific person who paid the money for you to come over on the boat. And then they would house you and they would feed you and you would work that off. And a typical indenture might be 7 years. So for 7 years, you would work off the cost of, shall we say, the plane ticket to come over because they didn't have the money on their own. And then once you were done with your indenture, you had a choice. You could stay and work if you could work something out with the manager of the plantation or the owner of whatever business you were working for, or you could go off on your own. And at one point in time, you had a lot of people who were welching on the indentured. The indentured servants were told, well, no, actually, it starts when you land here, or it starts when I appointed you to this position. So a lot of them felt that their agreements had been ignored, or they had not met promises that were made in the indenture. And so a number of them got very upset and joined a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who was very upset about other things that were going on. So it was just kind of a mass mob movement. And they went through a lot of different areas in colonial Virginia and burned places. And so it was clear to a lot of those people at that time that indentured servitude was not the answer to the labor problem. It's the number one problem in the British colonies is labor. There's lots of area for land to be cultivated and for money to be made with crops. At that time, tobacco was the number one cash crop in most of these mid-Atlantic states. And so after the rampaging of Bacon's rebellion, a lot of them said, you know what would really solve our problem would be African slaves, which was already happening in a lot of places in the Caribbean. The Spanish have been using this as a main source of labor for a number of years. And so that's how slavery came to America. Contrary to what some recent badly sourced books have done, slavery was not early on. Indentured servitude was the main source of labor for a while. But after Bacon's rebellion, a lot of people said, well, we won't have problems with these people. And so that's why slavery became a big solution when indentured servitude seems like it's not going to fit the bill anymore. But the Bacon's rebellion was the first kind of uprising. And again, one of the subtitles of this talk, of course, is Peaceable Assembly. Bacon's Rebellion was not a peaceable assembly, but it did make people who were in power afraid of large groups of people, especially those who were of a lesser group. Yeah? We're talking in the mid-1600s. Right now, it's escaped me, but you know, it is the turning point where you start seeing them turn more heavily towards slavery. So Colonial America. Colonial America is growing all during this period of time. The English Civil War is going on. People are making hand over fist money. You have not a lot of regulation going on of businesses. At this point in time, late 1600s, early 1700s, people who had businesses in colonial America were doing well because there was nobody minding the store, so to speak. And so you're only supposed to trade with the mother country when you're a colony. It's called mercantilism. It's one of the things you talk to my middle schoolers today, they know that back and forth. We've been talking about that a lot lately. But during the time of the English Civil War and some of the uprising going on after that and all the confusion with the different kings and everything, they're not watching the store. And so colonials are trading with the Spanish in the Caribbean. They're trading with the French up in Canada. They're trading with Native Americans. They're trading with the Dutch in New Netherlands and New Amsterdam. So there's all kinds of trading outside the British Empire, which is outside the rules. But there's two ways they're getting around it. Either there's not enough enforcement going on, or a little bit of money to the customs agent under the table, and it's a lot cheaper than paying the tax. So we really had a time when there was a lot of piracy and smuggling and all those things going on. And we'll talk about that again as we talk about the rise of the American Revolution. So the French and Indian War happens from 1753 to 1763, and that cost Great Britain a lot of money. They went into debt to send armies over. And at the same time that this is happening, a war is being fought between France and England and Europe. It's known as the 7 Years' War over there. We call it the French and Indian War because we're fighting French and Indians. And yes, that was a term that we still use during that period of time. So for decades, the colonials who had avoided all these restrictions had taxed themselves. They had their own colonial legislatures since the early founding of all their colonies. They would found a colony, they would set up a group, they would have a legislature, they would tax themselves. And the only people, I was talking with my students the other day about this, I said, now who could vote in those days? It was white men who owned property. Why? Because they're the ones that paid the taxes. And they said, gee, if they're the ones that pay the taxes, they should be the ones who decide who's elected and then those people that get elected will decide what to do with the tax money. We need more tax money to build a road. All right, we'll have to raise taxes. But they did it on themselves because they knew they weren't going to be micromanaged from a king and a parliament an ocean away. Okay, so that's what they were used to. And it's all part of this theory of mercantilism. We're gonna send all these goods over to England. They're gonna make money off that. That's fine. They should make money off that, and we'll make money too producing all that for them. So a whole country of pirates and smugglers and chiselers and all sorts of things like that until the French and Indian War ends. And the British look at it and they go, we took on all this debt. So we've got to pay for that debt somehow. Well, we've been over there and we see that those British colonials have made a lot of money over there in the New World. They should share some of the burden of it. And that's okay with the British colonials. The problem was it seemed like they were the only ones who were bringing on that burden. So when things like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and all these other taxes that come out, they're only on the colonials in North America. They're not being paid by the people that they feel are benefiting from all these goods that are going back to England and then turning the lumber into ships and turning the codfish into feed and all sorts of stuff that they're doing with the raw materials that they're sending back to England. Why are we the only one who are paying those taxes? And by the way, we don't have any say-so. You know, when they say no taxation without representation, what they really say is no taxation without some say-so, without some explaining. You know, if you tax this, then that's going to be a problem. Anything you tax discourages that. You remove that tax or you subsidize it, you encourage it. So they're basically saying you are depressing some of our industries because you are taxing those industries. And the Stamp Act is the one that's most interesting. It's a, can I move this down a little bit probably? It's a big boo-boo.
The cursor disappears when it's on there, so it's hard.
Okay, well, it's just the little bar here is blocking one. It's okay, I'll figure it out. I have a head that turns. This is one that hits everyone. They didn't think this through, and this is exactly the kind of problem they're pointing at. The stamp is supposed to be on anything paper. So any documents, a marriage license, you know, any sort of a deed, has to have the stamp on it. Okay, that's not much of a problem. Again, who are the people that can pay that tax? White men who own property, except playing cards. Playing cards are made of paper. So they would have a pack of playing cards, and you had to have a stamp on it. Who are the people who are playing playing cards? In Boston, it was mainly the sailors who are waiting until the ship's going to sail. So they're going through, and you know, these are not the plastic cover ones that we have today. They're going through these playing cards fairly, you know, regularly, and each time they have to pay more for that pack of cards because it's got a stamp on it. So now it's not just affecting people of means, it's affecting everybody. And that's why the Stamp Act was resisted so much. So they figured out, how are we going to stop this? We don't have any representation, we can't pass any law, we can't elect anybody, and so their way to stop it, their most effective way to stop it, was to attack the tax collector. So soon, that's a job nobody wants. I want to be a tax collector. No, thank you. No, we're looking for somebody. And so sooner or later, no one will take the job. And so when that gets back to England, say, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Okay, that's not such a good idea. Well, what are good ideas? And so they come up with all sorts of, well, we can tax specific things. The Townshend Acts are passed. Now, it's named after Charles Townshend, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which means he's basically the Treasury guy. And he says, well, we're just going to put a little tax on paint, lead, glass, and tea. Just so happens those are things that cannot be made in the colonies. Those are things that have to be imported from England. So any of these big things that you need are going to be imported from England, are going to have a tax on them. And these are very necessary things. Again, think about those homes in Boston. You have to have windows there when you get a nor'easter going. And how are you going to keep that glass from leaking, that window from, well, you put lead sealing around the outside of it. And then you want to paint it so it will seal against the weather. And then, of course, everyone drinks tea because tea is considered healthy. Now, not everybody here is a fan of tea, but the fact of the matter is they didn't know that tea made you healthy because you had to boil the water to put the tea in there. And that's why it was considered healthy. So these were things that, again, they saw very targeted against the British colonials in America. They were finding it just another way. So that's when the boycotts start happening. All right, we're not going to buy these imported things. We'll find another way. We'll find glass, out of old buildings. We'll find another way to get tea. And the man you see here, who's famous for the big signature on our Declaration of Independence, John Hancock, is probably the richest man in America. And what does he do? One of his main sidelines is smuggling tea into Boston through dropping it off at Cape Cod or some other place and then finding a way to get it into the shops. And so that's what he did. The only leverage they had on Parliament was to hit them in the pocketbook where it would hurt. And so you start having marches. We're not going to, go with these taxes. We're not going to buy goods. We're going to have what's called a non-importation agreement. And it's these kind of taxes, especially the tea tax, is going to hit people hard. And smugglers are looking at it and say, we're going to be okay as long as they can't get that tea on board. Now, if they get that tea on board, there's competition for our smuggled tea, which is going to be more expensive because it costs more to smuggle things in because, how many people do we have to bribe or, how special way do we have to get the tea in there? So John Hancock knew that he could charge more for his tea as long as the British tea didn't come onto shore. And it made him one of the richest men in the colonies. And that's the reason for our Tea Party. That tea had been sitting in those ships for months. And the dock workers would not offload the tea. Hancock made sure that they knew if they offload that tea, it's going to kill my business. Those guys work for Hancock. So they're not going to offload that tea. So it sat there for a long time. They knew the longer it sat there, sooner or later, they would find somebody who they could pay more money who would offload the tea. So how do you make sure that the East India Tea Companies, which by the way is a government business, okay? So it's a monopoly, a government business, make sure the tea doesn't come on shore? Well, if we just dump the tea in the water. And when you do that, it ruins the tea. So that's what happened. By dumping the tea in the water, it ruined the tea. They're all cheering because they know now that they're saved because they count on this money from smuggling, from Hancock and others. People get employment that way. It keeps the profits going in Boston that way. But the problem is it's government property. So the British government says, that's it. We've got to handle these rowdies here in Boston. So they passed what's known as the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. And the number one thing they did, which killed the economy in Boston, is they closed the port. Without the port of Boston being open, there's no economy in Boston. So they closed the port of Boston. They revoked Massachusetts' charter for government, which goes all the way back to James I, and said you can't have your colonial legislature meet anymore. Remember this is something that's going to come up again in the future, a government that's able to say, you can't meet anymore. Said you can't have town meetings anymore. Those will be called unlawful assemblies. And that from now on, the trial of British soldiers would only take place in England. Now, those of you who know your history a little bit know that there was a very big major trial of people involved in what was called the Boston Massacre, which Revolutionary John Adams actually got those soldiers acquitted of that. So as far as they're concerned, wait a minute, what's wrong with our system of trial here in the colonies? And so it was kind of a way of saying, yeah, we don't trust you. You're not real loyal British citizens. And so these are all these things we're going to do. And in order to make sure they made their point, they expanded provincial Quebec into some of the territory that was considered Massachusetts colony lands. So this is another way of saying we're going to cut you down to size and we're going to use one of our other provinces to come in there. It's known as the Quebec Act, okay? Now what it did do is it united all the other colonies who saw this as a parliamentary threat to all of them. If they can do this to Massachusetts, how do we know they won't do this to Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania or any of the other colonies? And it's as a result of that that you have the First Continental Congress. Now, the condition laid down by the British government was that when the damages are paid for the tea, we will lift this. And the colonists there in Boston knew that's the only leverage they had. is to refuse to pay the damage for the tea. As far as they were concerned, there wasn't even an attempt to find some sort of compromise solution. It was, pay up or else. They felt like they weren't being treated as citizens. They were all being accused of being complicit, and they were all being accused of almost being a foreign country, that they were under occupation. This is also when the quartering of troops started happening during that time. That's our third amendment to the Constitution. We never had to use it, but they wanted to make sure it was in the Constitution that you cannot force people to quarter troops in their homes. All right, so all these things, many of these things are going to be remedied in our Bill of Rights because of what happens here under the Intolerable Acts. All right, so move past, our timeline back to American independence and President Washington, and everything we think is always wonderful once Washington becomes president, and that's not quite true. We could talk about some of the problems that George Washington had, but one of the interesting parts was the protest to what was known as Jay's Treaty. My kids are going to have fun with this in the class the other day. John Jay was the first Supreme Court Chief Justice in the United States history, but he also did a lot of different tasks for the Washington administration. They'd been part of the group that had negotiated the peace at the end of the Revolutionary War over in France. And so Washington said, you're a good man. I trust you to do something. Please go to England and negotiate a treaty with Britain. There's some things that they haven't followed through on from our peace treaty, and we need you to bring that around. And so there's a lot of hard feelings in America about some of these promises that the British had made and not kept. Like they were still having forts out west in the new lands that were part of the United States. And they were selling liquor and guns to the native tribes. Not a good combination. And so this is part of the promise. And they want Jay to go to England and get some of these things taken care of. And when he goes to England, he doesn't know it, but because it will cause problems and hopefully benefit him politically. And I hate to say this, I know everybody loves this rap version of Hamilton. I haven't seen it yet because I never trust Hollywood or any entertainment industry to do any sort of justice to history. But Hamilton, in order to make himself more politically viable, is leaking our negotiating stance on this treaty to the British, unbeknownst to poor John Jay. And so he finds, for the most part, he can hardly get anything that he wants to get, because Hamilton's let him know that they'll take just about any kind of agreement as a treaty, and that's exactly what happened. That's why I call it John Jay's nothing burger. It's not his fault. He was stabbed in the back. And so he comes back and announces, well, they say they'll let us continue to dry our fish on the shores of Newfoundland. They go, well, what about the forts? No, I wasn't able to get them. Well, what about the guns and the liquor? No, I wasn't able to get anything about that. Well, what about the trade? No, not able to do anything about that. So people are very unhappy with John Jay. And what you see here is a woodcut that was done there hanging John Jay in effigy. And it was very much an unpopular treaty. And so I guess you'd say it's peaceable from the standpoint of nobody's getting hurt in there, except probably John Jay's feelings, particularly, being one of the revolutionaries himself. But it's the first kind of in the new country with the new Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all that, to see some kind of really organized protest going on. And that is how unhappy they were with the results of John's treaty. And even with all of Washington's influence, it just barely got passed in the Senate. In fact, there are even some reports, and we haven't found anything strong in this, that they actually hung Washington in effigy. So we all know how it can get when things get crazy politically. If they were hanging George Washington in effigy, there was some craziness going on. All right. So bring us up to 1798, 1799, and 1800. During that period of time, and most Americans are unaware of this, there was an undeclared war between France and the United States. How did that happen? My students say to me. And I say, well, remember that France had helped us in the revolution. It helped us win our independence. And they were now at war with most of Europe and definitely with England. And so the French wanted us to take their side. And Washington's attitude is, we want to stay out of this. We're just trying to get our act together. They're hanging John Jay in effigy. I don't need a war out of Europe's problems. And so the French were very unhappy with us. And we were continuing to trade with England. So the French saw that as we were certainly an ally to England. Now, we were happy to trade with both of them, but the French were particularly unhappy that we were trading with England. And so we started getting attacked by French naval ships. And we didn't really have a navy at that period of time. We were a maritime nation and very involved in trade. And so here we are in this undeclared war of France from 1798 to 1800. We're getting all ready to get an army together. In fact, we'd even ask Washington, would you come back and be the general for the army if we have to go to war with France? He says, no, but Hamilton can take my place, you know. And they didn't know what Hamilton had been doing before John Jay's treaty, so nobody trusts Hamilton at this point in time. Aaron Burr, obviously, one of the ones who doesn't trust him. And so Adams' party, the Federalists, who control Congress, say to President Adams, say, look, we need to have some sort of control on the opposition party, just now starting to have political parties. And in this case, it's the Federalists who are the ones who are in support of the Constitution, who are the party that supposedly is John Adams' party, and Jefferson's supporters who ran against Adams for the presidency in 1796 and lost. And his supporters call themselves Democratic Republicans. And they are friends to France, and the Federalists are friends to England, okay? So this support that the Democratic Republicans are showing to France at a time when we're in undeclared war with France is considered an attack on the government. And Jefferson's going out and funding newspapers that are attacking Adams and the Federalists. They're supporting the French. And so that is called sedition by the Federalists in Congress. So they pass an act called the Sedition Act. Usually we talk about the Alien and Sedition Act. I don't want to get in the Alien Act, it's too complicated. But the Sedition Act is very simple. If you speak out against the government, you, you are guilty of sedition. We will come back to that word in World War I, okay? Sedition. So the Sedition Act was passed. Adams looks at it and says, I don't think this is right. This isn't like, this isn't with our Bill of Rights. But at the same time, his attitude is, and this is the way it was in these days, that a president saw himself as an executive, but not necessarily a power of his own. And so unless he saw something unconstitutional, remember, we don't have a Supreme Court at this time who's ruling on what's constitutional or not. You're kind of making a judgment call on your own. And Adams, in the end, makes a mistake and signs it because Congress represents the people. This must be what the people want. I will sign it. And so they actually used the Sedition Act to jail newspapermen in support of Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans during this period of time, including one of the most prominent was Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, was put into jail under the Sedition Act. Today we look at it and go, well, freedom of the press. Yes, because we have 200 years of precedent in Supreme Court rulings since then to look at and say, well, of course we decided in a way, but they haven't gotten there yet, okay? It's like, I always tell my kids, it's like a new board game and you don't know how to play the board game. And the whole time you're going there, you're reading the instructions. Well, I think we do this next. And then later on you say, I think I made a bad judgment. I think it's supposed to be the other way. That's the way it was trying to run the country in the early years with the Constitution. They were still trying to find their way along to see how this language would go. All right, so the Sedition Act is a basic violation of rights, certainly freedom of speech and certainly freedom of the press. And I know you're bringing me something. Yes, thank you very much. So next we go to the War of 1812. Wars kind of bring these things out. Think about this for a second. Think about all the protests that we've seen over the history of this country. A lot of them come around wars because it brings out extreme passions usually. So that's what we're talking about here. So the War of 1812, I'll try to boil it down really quick. I just finished going through this with my high schoolers. The War of 1812 is basically, once again, some of the same things that I just talked about. The British forts are still out west. There are still British forts in places like Indiana and Michigan and Illinois, because those states haven't really, they're not states yet. The only one that's a state is Ohio. The other ones are territories. And so the British are still selling guns and liquor to the Indians. They're still causing problems, and we want that to stop. And they're stealing our sailors off the high seas, because as a British sailor, you got paid $8 a month if you were in the British Navy, but you can make $24 a month if you sailed in the United States maritime. doing trade, and it's a lot safer. You're not going to get shot at by the French Navy if you're on an American maritime ship. So they started saying, well, you've got British guys who deserted the British Navy, and some of them did, and they were on your ship. And then if they got a few Americans in there, well, you were a Britisher 20 or 30 years ago anyway, we're grabbing him too. And so they started grabbing our people. And eventually President Madison says, we're going to have to protect our sovereignty, and we declare war. So that's how the War of 1812 happens. Well, the vote was very regional. There wasn't a single vote from a congressman in New England who voted for the declaration of war. But the Southerners all voted for it, and the Westerners all voted for it. The Westerners wanted those British forts out of there, and the Southerners felt that they had not had the kind of trade that they needed to, and that a lot of their ships were getting their sailors stolen. So it's only the New Englanders who voted against it because that was their main trading partner. They were going to war with their main trading partner. So during the War of 1812, New England was constantly protesting against the war. In fact, it got so bad at different points in time, they were thinking about seceding or maybe rejoining Great Britain. And in 1815, they had a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, known as the Hartford Convention. That's what the cartoon is here. At the bottom here, the king saying, oh, come back to me. I'm happy to have you come back. And the guy says, well, I'm trying to decide. And the guy at the bottom is one of the other New England states, says, I'm too afraid to do it. Also, they're making fun of them. These are the other states down in the South and the Mid-Atlantic. They're making fun of them. So anyway, the Hartford Convention finishes up. And they've been protesting, they've written notes, they've petitioned. And so at the convention, they've come up with a whole series of constitutional amendments, which actually some of them made sense. Like, if we're going to go to war, it should be a super majority, not just a majority vote. If you're going to drag the whole country to war, then it should be a super majority. Probably not a bad idea, although how many wars have we been in over the last 100 years where we never had a declaration of war? We've had 4 in our history, I think, declarations of war. 1812, Mexican War, World War I, World War II. That's it. All the other ones that we've just kind of found ourselves in. But anyway, so they come to Washington, D.C. with this thing. We've got these amendments we want to have, and we're protesting, we're unhappy. And what's the big party going on here about? Oh, great news, the war is over, we signed a peace agreement, and Andrew Jackson just defeated the British at New Orleans. What's that you've got there? Oh, nothing. I crack that joke with my kids all the time. Oh, nothing. Wait, well, let me see what. Oh, no, oh, don't take that. What? And so the Federalist Party is branded as traitors. And 1816 is the last time the Federalist Party exists. Rufus King is the last presidential nominee for the Federalist Party. There is no party after that. And so their protests were based on some reasonable assertions, but in this case, it actually probably in the end backfired on them because they were, it was such an extreme position to think about seceding. That's the other thing I love to tell the kids. The first secession movement was not the South in the Civil War. The first secession movement was New England in the War of 1812, okay? All right, moving on. Movements. So the 19th century is full of movements. One of the first big ones is the women's rights movement. The big one in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York. If you go there today, this is a patch from the Seneca Falls setup there. They've got a wonderful display of all these women that have been involved in women's rights throughout history. So the first conference is held in Seneca Falls, New York. And there's kind of an alliance that goes on at Seneca Falls because one of the people who shows up there is this young man named Frederick Douglass. And another woman, older woman, named Sojourner Truth. And so there's this meeting of rights issues that happens in the wake of the Seneca Falls conference. So you get abolitionists and women's rights people that are all starting to find we're looking for the same thing. So the beginning of the suffragette movement happens after that meeting. Now, their problem is, after the Civil War, there's all these amendments proposed to clean up the problem of slavery. 13th eliminates slavery. The 14th gives equal citizenship to everyone. And the 15th gives voting rights to everyone. But specifically left out of both of those are women. And the women are very unhappy with the abolitionists because they thought they had a promise from them. We'll make sure when we do these amendments that we'll make sure that it's clear that women are part of that, and it didn't happen, okay? They thought that would have hurt the odds of getting those things ratified by the states if they had had women in there. Because at that time, who was going to be able to vote for that? Not women, only men were going to ratify that. That's the amazing thing about when we eventually do get women to vote, that who gave them the right to vote, and by ratifying that amendment, it had to be men because the women didn't have a vote yet. Anyway, so the 14th Amendment was a big disappointment. They went from having meetings to having protests. St. Louis was a real heart of the suffragette movement here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We have a proud history of being involved in the suffragette movement here. You had eventually in the turn of the century hunger strikes that went on, and women gave their lives. So if you ever get a chance to, there's a movie called Steel-Jawed Angels, I think it's called, which is about the suffragette movement, and it's worth watching. Anyway, their biggest protest right before we finally got the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920 was at the Democratic National Convention, which was held here in St. Louis. And they wanted to make sure that President Wilson pledged that he'd get behind the women's movement to get the 19th Amendment ratified. It wasn't yet voted through yet, but they wanted his support for that, which he kind of gave a half-hearted support for. Now, the only major industrialized, westernized country that preceded us in giving women the right to vote was New Zealand. New Zealand approved women's vote in 1917, and the 19th Amendment was ratified in this country in 1920. So when everybody talks about how slow we were to it, just remember we were way ahead of the rest of Western society. And there are some countries that will remain nameless that still have not given. And I'm not talking about, Middle Eastern or something like that. I'm talking about Western societies where they still haven't given women the full right to vote. All right, moving on in the 19th century movements, the Abolition movement. And that's one that's going to be very visible. And once again, the St. Louis area here has a very proud history in the Abolition movement. It started mainly with a lot of Northern Christian leaders who saw it as an unchristian way to treat a fellow human being. And so a lot of the early abolitionists were preachers who went everywhere. And most of you hopefully are aware of Elijah Lovejoy, who was the guy who produced the newspaper and then kept bringing it over to St. Louis. Or you remember, Missouri comes into the Union in 1821 as a slave state. Slavery was legal here until after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment is ratified. And so Elijah Lovejoy is producing this paper. And finally, the slavery supporters of St. Louis had enough, and they went over there and they had dumped his press into the Mississippi a couple of times, and this time they shot him. So if you drive over the Clark Bridge as you're heading into Alton and you look on the little hill up there, there's a nice little column you'll see on top of that is a statue of Elijah Lovejoy, and that's a monument paying homage to him. We've taken a group there before, and it's really worth going to visit and paying homage to him. So the kinds of demonstrations that you saw at the time, newspaper articles, specific newspaper, William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator was one of the most popular abolitionists, protest, even lawsuits, of course, because St. Louis is also where the original trial in the Dred Scott cases. Whenever I see those pictures, Busch Stadium and the Arch, and then I see that green dome of the district court down there, that green dome court is where Dred Scott's trial was held. And it got appealed, and it got appealed, and I don't even want to talk about how badly, people say, well, sometimes the Supreme Court makes mistakes. Yeah, Dred Scott versus Sanford, that's probably the biggest one that we've talked about. So anyway, the Dred Scott case was here, and this is where you eventually saw activism go on in a very strong way. William Lloyd Garrison was beat up a couple of times. One time it almost killed him. And it didn't stop him publishing, it didn't stop protesting. Uncle Tom's Cabin had a big thing to do with it. A famous quote, Lincoln had Harry Beecher Stowe come to the White House one time, and he says, "Is this the little woman that started this great war?" So it was a big part of that. And the North was very visible and very active in protests and meetings and stuff, resisting the Fugitive Slave Act that was part of the Compromise of 1850. Which was supposed to allow people in the North to send back escaped slaves back to their owners down south. And when they finally realized, the South realized that the Northerners were not going to comply with that federal law. They had other federal laws they expected the South to comply with, but when it came to the Fugitive Slave Act, they would not comply with that. That's one of the reasons the South said, well, what's the point of us staying in this union if you're not even going to follow your own rules? I'm not taking their side. I'm explaining. You have to, in history, you have to understand how people were thinking at that time to try to make sense out of the actions and the events that happened in the wake of that. And as far as the South was concerned, I was married into a Southern family for some time. You have to, yeah, I got it, an earful. You have to understand where they were coming from. And where they were coming from was, we thought it meant this when we ratified the Constitution, and now we felt it was being interpreted in a way that didn't make any sense. And so we don't want to be part of this club anymore. And they thought they had every right to leave. And the North says, you can't leave. And Lincoln really famously said one time, talking to somebody, he said, no, we can just get a divorce and divide up the property. That's not the way it works. Our union is permanent. Anyway, that's what the Civil War is about. All right. Now, there is a Northern anti-Civil War protest movement, which happens during the Civil War. I'm talking about Ohio here. I'm talking about Pennsylvania. I'm not talking about border states even. I'm talking about deep anti-war people who felt that, look, we don't like slavery, or some of them said slavery's fine, it's in the Constitution. So unless you're going to amend the Constitution, you can't tell them they can't have slavery, or just let the South go. You know, some people just said, look, it's not worth the lives it would cost to keep them in the Union. Let them go. We don't want them in our club anymore. So there's a lot of different reasons why there was an anti-war movement during the Civil War. Now, most of the ones who opposed it were Northern Democrats. And this group that I'm showing you right here are the leaders of that group. And they called themselves, or they were known as, Copperheads. And they were called Copperheads because they would take a copper penny like that, and they would wear it on their lapel, because in those, it's not till Lincoln's penny in 1909 that you get the first American coin with a president on it. Until that time, it was a walking liberty or a lady had a liberty or an eagle or something like that. You didn't have people on the coins. You had a few on the money, but not on the coins. And so they would take these liberty heads and they would wear them as a lapel, and that's how you identified that you were an anti-war person. So that's why they were called Copperheads, because they wore these copper head of liberty pennies as a lapel pin. Okay. The next big moment of protests during this time is during the Civil War. By 1863, the war was several months longer than people thought it was going to be, and we're starting to run out of some of the volunteers in the North. The South had a draft early on. Within about 9 months after the war starts, they start drafting people in the South. The North didn't start drafting until 1863. And so Gettysburg happens, and this is a huge battle on these thousands of casualties, and now we need to draft more people to have bodies in there. And who are the ones who get drafted? People that are new. Immigrants, okay? They get off the boat. How'd you like to make 20 bucks a month? Sure, right, fine. Come over here, sign your name. All right, now what am I doing? Get over here, and you're going to get on a uniform. Here's your rifle. You're going to train, that sort of thing. Now, if you were wealthy and you got drafted, like Teddy Roosevelt's father, you could pay someone else to take your place for $300. You could buy a substitute, okay? And a lot of them did that. But if you were a poor person, guess what? No dice. Now, some guys would get a bounty. After a while, you figured out, I can get a bounty. I can go over here and I can sign up. I get 50 bucks. And then you run off and you change your name and you go to Ohio and you do the same thing again, because there's no ID. You know, there's no national network. But in this case, they're tracking people down, and particularly the Irish coming off the boat. So what happens? We have draft riots in July of 1863, right after Gettysburg. And the Irish mainly are the ones who are rioting because they're mainly the ones who can't get out of the draft. And they look at things, they say, it's really easy for us to tell who are the problem in this whole thing. It's the black people. This is over slavery. And they're coming up from the South. They're getting out of being slaves because the Army's gone and conquered these areas. And they're not going to stay in the South where they can get recaptured and put back into slavery. They're coming up north. And they're willing to work for a lot less than the Irishmen coming right off the boat. So the mob, the Irish mob who are riding in these draft rights, start lynching blacks during this protest. It still is to this day the worst urban rioting that the United States has ever experienced, with the draft riots in New York City in 1863. Largest disturbance, a lot of it concentrated in Manhattan. In the end, they had to bring in troops who had been resting up after, a long battle at Gettysburg. They put them on a train and got them to New York City and said, shoot to kill if you have to. And that stopped it. You could not do that today, obviously, but that did stop the riots at that point in time. Okay, that's what you see back in this picture, by the way. They put the cannon out there, and once that happened, okay, we're out of here. And that stopped the riot. Okay, so that's the protest, I guess you could say, and certainly, and that's not a peaceable assembly, obviously. More, after the Civil War, you really get the rise of a morality movement and rights movements start happening at this time. That's when you really get the Temperance Movement, which is largely women, and you get after they realize that they're not going to get anything out of the 14th Amendment, a newly reinvigorated suffrage movement for women. And some of you may have seen this picture before on the bottom. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. I used to show that to my classes, and all the guys said, they're safe. Anyway, I know, high school kids, what can you say? By this point in time, people had figured out what alcohol was doing to families. In those days, there was no direct deposit, there's no write a check. At the end of the week, you got your money. And unfortunately, that payment would probably come somewhere on your way home. There was a bar. And not all that, you'd worked hard, you earned that, and how much of that money would actually get home, and where's the money pay? Well, this is what's left. Well, what did you do with the rest of it? And so it became very clear to a lot of people that alcohol was devastating families, either because of loss of income or because, of angry drunks. And so that's when the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, began to rise during that period of time. And those two movements oftentimes combined, and that you not only wanted the temperance movement to get people to stop drinking alcohol, but they knew that if they could get women the vote, they could vote to ban alcohol, or certainly restrict it better than they had been so far. And so those two kind of work together. So you had the WCTU and the suffrage movement working together, and they would do marches, and they would do hunger strikes, and they would have meetings, and they would march through areas, and they would make noise. Salvation Army was part of that too. It's when it started really beginning to grow during that period of time from the standpoint of the temperance, because that was a Christian movement at the same time. Great Depression. During the Great Depression was the time when we saw the big labor union movement. Obviously, blue-collar workers were the first ones usually fired during the early days of the Depression. And the way to kind of protect yourself a little better was to be able to form a labor union. For a long period of time, labor union increases had happened very gradually. But with the oncoming of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, knowing that a lot of his strength and support was in blue-collar workers, the labor union movement grew. And that didn't mean that it came easily. There were years of protest, there were years of violence. That's when the sit-in protest began to be used. That's when you would go in a bunch of workers and you would say, okay, we're not getting anywhere in our negotiations, so we're going to report to work, but we're not going to do any work. We're going to sit down, we're going to read a newspaper, the line's not going to move. And eventually the Supreme Court said, no, that's unconstitutional. You were paid to do this and you're not doing this. They have a right to fire you if they want to for non-performance of duty. But for a while there, when it caught on really big. And eventually some businesses thought, look, we're going to hire some guys to protect our company. We're going to hire non-labor workers to come in, and the non-labor workers would be attacked by these striking workers, and so you had a lot of violence. And so they would start trying to counter that by hiring some thugs for hire. And you saw a lot of things like you see down there at this bottom picture here, which is between some of the labor workers and between the thugs and the attacking of the people who were basically coming in and taking the jobs of the union workers. They were referred to as scabs. I think they still use some of that terminology to this day. And eventually legislation was passed during this time to protect strikers from being attacked by security hired by the workers, by the companies. And that did change some of the violence going on in the movement at the time. But the fact of the matter is both sides had times when there was violence going on. And eventually the Supreme Court had rulings such as you have the right to have a picket line. You have the right to be in a picket line without losing your job. You have a right to be in an organized labor strike. And the National Labor Relations Board was created during the Roosevelt administration to give protection to some of those rights, which were seen as basic rights to protest for better working conditions, for better pay, for better situation in your labor unions. That's considered to be an extension of the rights. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this. When I saw, I think we're going to find out some interesting things over the next number of months about January 6th. In particular, there's an Inspector General's report about January 6th, which has been delayed until after the election. I try not to be conspiratorial, but it's hard not to sometimes, because there's been rumors about a lot of things that happened there. But when I first saw some of the imagery, I was not watching it that day when it happened. When I first saw some of the imagery afterward, this is what I thought of. The Bonus Army of 1932. So let me tell you the story, because most Americans have no idea about this. World War I veterans were unique. It's the first time we've been in a war where we are not really attacked in our territory, and we fought the war outside of American territory. You ever heard of the veterans of foreign wars? That's where it comes from. I guess there was a small group that could have been formed fighting, the war against Spain, but more people died from malaria and yellow fever in that war than died from battle casualties. So World War I is the first real war that's fought outside the United States. And as that, since we were only supposed to have an army to protect our country, they felt they deserved special treatment. They deserved a bonus for being willing to fight this war over in France, which they did. And most Americans agreed. So in the 1920s, a bill was passed through Congress that said, yes, you deserve a bonus. And every veteran who's around in 1945 will be paid a bonus. It's going to keep us, in those days you didn't just say, sure, we'll spend it and we'll borrow it somehow. So they said it's going to take us some time, 20 years or so, to save up this money. And in 1945, we'll treat it like an insurance payment. It will mature and you'll get your bonus, okay? Well, of course, no one saw the Great Depression coming just 7 short years later. So by 1932, those World War I veterans will say, gee, we sure could use that money now. And it wasn't supposed to pay until 1945, which of course nobody knew they weren't going to be able to pay it in 1945 either. That's what we were paying for a war. But anyway, so they wanted it then. In the depths of the Depression, when no tax money is coming in, because nobody's working, okay? So Congress had no money, but they said, look, you spend money. We know that it's not going to kill you to pay the World War I veterans. And they marched on Washington. This is the Bonus Army set up on the steps of the Capitol building, demanding that Congress pass a bill to pay them their money now. And then Congress voted it down. And then they didn't leave. And then the police said leave. They wouldn't leave. Herbert Hoover called in the army. Douglas MacArthur led an army group with 6 tanks to chase the World War I veterans out of Washington, D.C. in the process of going through their tent city, which is in the Capitol, the Washington Mall, so that you see it burning there. In the background is the dome of the Capitol building. That probably cinched Hoover's loss in the election in 1932. But they drove them out, okay? And they, remember now, in those days, you didn't have TV. They all went to the movie theaters and saw this on their newsreels. They go, oh my gosh, we're sending our army after our World War I veterans. And so in 1936, they were paid. Congress passed it. FDR said, no, I don't have money for that. I've got money for all these other things, but not that. And he vetoed it, and they overrode his veto. So the veterans did get paid in 1936. But when I saw those pictures, protesting on the steps of the Capitol, people can't say, oh, this is unprecedented. No, it's not. Okay? All right. Supreme Court free speech rulings. We had a lot of free speech rulings with the Warren Court, which starts in the 1950s. This is one of the most famous ones, and it's one that my middle schoolers are going to be dealing with here in a couple of weeks when we have our unit on the U.S. Constitution. This is Tinker versus Des Moines. It's a brother-sister, the Tinkers, who were protesting the Vietnam War, and all they were doing was walking through the halls of their school wearing the peace armbands. And the school suspended them, said you can't do that. You're going to cause, a reaction with the kids who are in favor of the war, or maybe they have brothers or husbands, or not husbands, or fathers fighting in the war. And so they sued Des Moines schools. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's ruling in particular said free speech does not stop at the school door. That the school has to find some place, some way for them to exercise their right to free speech. And that continues to be one of the most famous free speech decisions in American history. This happened in '65. The decision by the court was made in 1969. The next one that most of us are familiar with, and it will be when you hear it, is the Miller versus California one about obscenity. And people said, what is obscenity? And the Supreme Court, I can't remember which one, it might have been Justice Douglas, said, look, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. Okay? And the point that they were making is that there is no way to determine obscenity. One person's obscenity is another person's art. And so there has not been a conviction that survives Supreme Court scrutiny on obscenity since this case was decided. Okay, you'll see local, brought them in, obscene materials, local court will be splashed all over your evening news. Believe me, it gets to a federal court, it's gone because of Miller versus California as the decision. And then finally, on this, Texas versus Johnson, which was really controversial, but one that you're probably familiar with. This is the one about flag burning. It was against the law in Texas to burn the American flag in a protest. And so the guy sued the state of Texas, Mr. Johnson, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said flag burning is political, and thus it's protected speech. And I'll get more into that in a little bit. It's protected speech. Is there a way for me to move that out of there, I guess, or not, or something like that? Now, when I used to teach government class at another school, is there a drag thing?
Quickly move it down a little bit, sorry.
I'm getting near the end here because my watch just reminded me.
Yeah, I can try to drag it a little bit more out of the way.
Probably not.
Yeah,
that'll work. That's good enough.
Okay. And
Should
then
be able to just click the play there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not
that's
on there
much
for the
better.
online people, it's just.
Oh,
here
okay,
that it's
just
not.
here that we're seeing, okay. This is one that I used to use all the time in my government classes, a really well done, believe it or not, made for TV movie that was done in the 1980s about this, the famous 𝐏𝐸𝐿𝐴 case, where a group of little American Nazis, the Blues Brothers had fun with this in the Blues Brothers movie, you ever seen that? Decided they wanted to march in 𝐏𝐸𝐿𝐴. Now, 𝐏𝐸𝐿𝐴 was chosen on purpose because 𝐏𝐸𝐿𝐴 at the time had the highest number of Holocaust survivors of any township in the United States. And so these guys decided that's where we want to march, okay? And this is one of the problems here. You have a peaceable assembly thing. As long as it's peaceable, you have the right to protest. And going back to these labor cases in the 30s where they said, look, if we stay peaceable, if we get attacked, that's one thing. But if we stay peaceable, we should have a right to assemble. And so the Nazis said, look, all we want to do is peaceable assembly. We want to be able to march. We want to be able to say what we want to say. And you are allowed to do that as long as on public property. No private property has to let you do that. If they want to let you do that, that's their business. But you have to give them a place to do that. So the problem for 𝐏𝐸𝐿𝐴 was, where can we find a place that is public property where they can go where it's not going to drive the citizens crazy? And that was one of the worries that they had. And so eventually they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court reinstated that we have to protect all speech, even speech that we hate, has to be protected. And it has to be on public property. It's up to the civic officials to find a place where you can have your demonstration. Maybe it's just some little driveway of the police station, fine. That will satisfy the constitutional requirements, but you have to be allowed to do that. And more than anything, the point that they were making is you can't limit people's speech. It's a very popular thing to say, we've got to control hate speech, because people, clap and, that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, there's no such thing. One person's hate speech is another person's petition. It's another person's right to their constitutional rights. Doesn't mean you have to approve of it, but you have to allow it. That's what we do. And frankly, I've had conversations plenty of times with different students about this, because it changes in the 20 years that I've been teaching. In the end, how are you going to know what's so bad about what they're saying if you don't hear them saying it? Okay? And so you engage them in a conversation. Why do you want to do that? Okay. Why do you think all these people should be killed? What about this? Don't they have a right to, how about their kids? Did they? And that's why you allow free speech. So in the 60s, as most of us who lived through that time remember, there was all kinds of marches, demonstration. Dr. King, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was his organization, the whole civil rights movement was very big at that time. Dr. King spent several stints in jail to protest what he felt was an unjust set of laws. I just want us to be able to register to vote. Well, you're trespassing, so you're going to jail. And then they get him there overnight, and some lawyer would come in and say, that's a violation. The Supreme Court said that. Oh, all right, and they'd let him go. He knew that. What better way to show an unjust law than be unjustly jailed for it? And it was successful. People said, why is that man in jail? He's just trying to help people register to vote. So, and again, this is another thing that we talked a lot in my government class when I used to teach that. The biggest one, of course, is the March on Washington, which was on TV. And is the one most known for the I Have a Dream speech, talking about no longer the color of your skin, but the content of your character. Words that ring really true to this day. American campuses, as we know, in the late 70s had marches and demonstrations and sit-ins against the war. There's a very famous picture was taken of a student sitting in the president's office at Columbia University. Okay, and they're just kind of enjoying taking over his office. And then eventually they left. And those huge anti-war demonstrations, which, interestingly enough, ceased as soon as the draft did. Not so peaceable assembly. The Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, formed in the early 1960s. I one time interviewed one of the co-founders of that when I was in my stage of my life when I was going to all these JFK assassination conferences. And he had written a book about that. And a splinter part of the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, was the Weather Underground. How many remember the term the Weather Underground? It came from that Bob Dylan thing. Do you know what the weather is? So anyway, the two biggest names at that time were these two people at the top. That's Bill Ayers and his wife Bernadine Dorn, who were fugitives from the law. They had been planning a bombing at the Pentagon. Some of their friends had been organizing a bomb when it blew up on them and killed a bunch of them. And so they went on the run, and eventually they did surrender themselves. They spent a little bit of jail time, and then they both went back working in the educational institutions. Yes, and interestingly enough, after they returned to a normal life, this is a picture of Bill Ayers standing on an American flag. This picture actually was published in an article that showed up in a magazine on an auspicious day, September 11th, 2001. Is that ironic or what? And who is Bill Ayers? What does Bill Ayers do? Well, he's still around, but his next claim to fame was he is the one that first held a political meeting that got Barack Obama's political career started in Illinois. So the big question today is social media and free speech. The importance of Section 230 is really critical in allowing free speech to continue in social media. What does that mean? Section 230 says that the social media companies are not responsible for the kinds of things that people post on there. If they were, they'd all go out of business tomorrow. There's no way to police social media any more than you could run around, put your hand over people's mouths saying things that are objectionable. And just the other day, a number of politicians who I probably don't even have the name for you were saying we need to repeal Section 230. And so you'll know what they're up to when they say that, because they don't like social media now, especially since some changes in ownership have come about in certain social media. So the rise of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp, all these social media now gives anybody opportunity to read anything, say anything, hear anything. And as long as it's legal, it should be permitted. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, that means pornography should not be easily accessible. That means pedophilia type of thing should not be permitted. And each country's different. Twitter just got taken out of national jail, so to speak, in Brazil. For a while, they were not allowed to work there because the government did like some to do. And Mr. Musk, who owns Twitter, said, look, we're going to allow as much free speech as each country's laws will let us do. That's the way it should be. That's what he felt it should be. The election of 2020 was this is something maybe not a lot of people know about, but Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Facebook, and by the way, I always tell my kids, I say, well, we don't use Facebook anymore. How many of you use Instagram? All the hands go up. I said, well, guess who owns Instagram? Guess who owns WhatsApp? See, this is the thing people don't know. It's the same people. It's Facebook. Or it's now known as Meta. Anyway, in 2020, Mr. Zuckerberg spent $450 million in reinforcement of the election machinery. And by that, I mean that they hired people to go in and do the election process and vote processing in a number of different areas, which meant that the local people didn't have to do that. They hired people to be more efficient and do that, but it just looked squirrely to everyone. And now most of those places, number one, no longer allow that. And number two, Mr. Zuckerberg recently said, and it hardly got published anywhere, it's so interesting, said, I'm sorry and I won't do it again, okay? Now, you don't usually say, I'm sorry, I won't do it again if you think you're up to a good thing. So anyway, that was the election of 2020 in the Zucker books. Of course, Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter has been controversial to a lot of people. What was most interesting was within 6 weeks after he bought it, he got into their files and took two people to introduce them, say, look, I've got all these files in here. You're going to read and see what's going on here. No one's going to take my word for it. And he brought in Matt Taibbi, who used to work for Rolling Stone, not exactly a right-wing organization, and Barry Weiss, who's got her own group called the Free Press. She used to be an editor at the New York Times. And they both released a number of these things and put some context into the communications going on. And the net of what it was is that Twitter was following instructions from members of the US government, particularly people at the FBI, as to what should and should not be allowed to be on Twitter, or people who should be banned from Twitter, or people who should be deboosted on Twitter. In other words, suddenly you say, why is nobody responding to my tweets when I used to get, 10,000 responses? And it's because your tweets were getting deboosted and people couldn't see them anymore. So not a lot has been said about that, which isn't a surprise because you'd have to see it reported by your corporate media in order to know that it's happened. So unless you're following the people who are staying on top of this important situation in today's digital media, that's what is going on. Movement causes into the 21st century. We've seen a lot. The Stonewall Review, I don't know if most people know about that. There was a gay bar called Stonewall in New York in 1969 that was raided by the police. And after that, people said, look, we should be treated like everyone else. Being gay shouldn't have anything to do with your rights. And so that was the beginning of the rise of the gay rights movement. Modern feminism and a lot of the social issues that go with that. Obviously, abortion is part of it. The recent movement in the transgender issues is part of that. The abortion versus pro-life movement. That's why I picked this picture at the bottom here. You see some that keep abortion safe and legal, other defund Planned Parenthood, I'm pro-life. That's all in front of the Supreme Court, whose recent Dobbs decision was a reversal of Roe versus Wade. What does that mean? That's been kept intentionally unclear. All it said was the federal government had no right to get involved in this. It's not in the Constitution. That should be a state issue. Amendment 10 says any powers not given in the Constitution to the federal government remains with the states or with the people. That's what James Madison wrote and what we approved in 1791. And so the Dobbs decision said Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided. Those of you here in Missouri know that we've got a vote coming up. It's called what, Amendment 4, is it, I think? Okay, and that's exactly what they're saying should be. Each state should have the right to decide. How do they want to regulate abortion? Do they want to allow abortion? You know, when do they want to allow abortion, et cetera, et cetera. That should not be the federal government to say, this covers everybody. So that's what the Dobbs decision was. And, you know, obviously there are a lot of changes going on. That most of these issues are ending up in the Supreme Court, and they really have no business being there. They should be up to the people's elected representatives to decide. But a lot of them don't want to deal with the issues. Congress doesn't want to deal with the issues. It's a good way to lose some group or another. You need to get reelected. The Supreme Court justices are there permanently. Let them make the decision. And believe me, they're not happy because that's not something they feel they should get involved in. And all they can do is say, look, either it's something that the Constitution covers if it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it's not our job to rule on that. You people need to tell your elected officials what you want. And that's what we're doing right now. And so this is a very important that free speech be allowed here, and that people, if there's more talk and less heat, both sides will be able to hopefully find some middle ground at some point in time. Or one side will persuade the other side. And some of this is because of the changing demographics in our country. 150 years ago, there weren't many women that didn't want to get married. Today, you have a large group of women who say, well, I may never get married, I may not have children. Fine, but that also means they're going to be less interested in issues that might affect children or that might affect a family, that sort of thing. And so our representatives are going to reflect those changing demographics. And people are going to have to say, okay, where's the middle ground where we can make everyone feel like they've got a spot that works for them in a republic like we have. Okay. Finally, talking about the rise of the Tea Party, and of course, a lot of this came out of the government debt that came in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008. And after Mr. Obama was elected, a lot of programs went through to say, well, we're going to try to give mortgage money to certain people. And Rick Santelli, who was a guy who was on the floor of the stock exchange for CNBC, one day went on about a 15-minute rant about, I'd like somebody to pay for my mortgage. Wouldn't all you guys like to? Yeah, what we need is a new Tea Party movement and throw the tea in the harbor, something like that. And that kind of got things going. And so that reaction to government transference of money from taxpayers to tax non-payers is what led to the Tea Party movement, and the fact that the government, they felt, was out of control, was taxing too much, and people took tea and turned it into taxed enough already, and you saw quite a movement, and it resulted in quite the congressional wave that happened in 2010 in reaction to that. So there's still parts of that around in the country. I think a lot of people who were involved in that movement became disillusioned that there's really much that can be done. It's really difficult to talk people out of having government give them free money. It's a very alluring thing, and it's a very easy thing for politicians to do, and it can kick that can down the road, and somebody younger is going to have to pay all that debt at some point in time. Finally, the election of 2016 and the shock of Donald Trump coming, and we saw a lot of, this gal was screaming. I've seen that meme over and over. The minute that he swore his oath, nobody saw it coming. I think that was part of one of the reasons that election caused such a big brouhaha, is that no one expected it. And when it happened, DC on Inauguration Day, they haven't talked much about this either. There was a lot of trashing of Washington, D.C. that happened that. Nobody went to jail for it. They were all released from jail. You started seeing women protesting with, I think you all know what I'm talking about there, but those pink hats that went on there. You also saw protests about COVID. You saw protests in Seattle an area of Seattle that was considered to be, we've got our own little country here. Portland saw weeks and weeks of riots and burning of a federal building in the Antifa versus non-Antifa riots that went on. So again, assembly, but not necessarily peaceable assembly. It might start that way, but it was difficult to keep them that way. And the question is, I guess, depending on what happens on November 5th, will we see things like that again in 2024? The most recent one, and this ends my slide presentation here, is what's been going on at places like Columbia University. And there are two main phrases that you hear there. One is free Palestine, and the other is from the river to the sea. And most of those people, when you ask them, what does that mean? They say, well, we're in favor of the Palestinians. I said, okay, well, what does that mean to Israel? Because from the river to the sea means no Israel. But I don't think a lot of them know that. So the question is there a problem with the demonstrations like at Columbia? Well, it's up to Columbia. Guess what? It's private property. If they want to have them demonstrate there, fine, have them demonstrate there. If they say, we don't want you to demonstrate, then they need to go find a public place and sign up and put down a bond probably and get a place with the police that they can have their organized, but they have the right to voice their ideas like anyone else. And then like I said before, I really have a problem with this term that's thrown around so easily called hate speech. One person's right to speak their mind is someone else's hate speech. There is no hate speech. There may be speech that's hateful, but you can't ban that. Now, we are the only country like that. I know there are people in Canada and Britain and France, civilized nations, where people are thrown in jail for what they've said. The only thing that's banned in this country is inciting speech or threatening speech. Other than that, speech is political and it's protected. And that's the way our country's been since the founded. And that, I think what's going to be interesting about the 2020 election and the January 6th thing is whenever you get a situation where people feel there was something squirrely about the results, one of the things that's been great about this country, you vote, and your guy might win or your guy might lose, but you accept the results and you move on. The people have decided. If you have reason to have serious doubts about that, that makes it difficult because it will work as well as long as the losers feel that it was fair, then they can accept the results. If they don't feel it was fair, that makes it difficult. And that's what happened in 2020. And some of the actions of our government did not do a lot to support the idea that everything was on the up and up. I think when you get this Inspector General's report, one of the things we want to know is there are reason to believe from testimony from people, there's a lot of government undercover people that day. And some of them were accused of encouraging people to go bang down the door or to rip down this or to go into this different area. So it might have been that a lot of people would have just been protesting there and climbing the walls or something like that, but would not have gone inside the Capitol building had there not been other people inciting them to do so. And then the next question, and this is something that's been said without any doubt, is that it has been kept quiet for a long time that a couple of days before the demonstrations, the president asked for National Guard to be brought in, and he was turned down. And so that's going to be interesting to see if that's true or not. And finally, the committee that looked into this. So, well, the congressional committee looked into that. But this is the only congressional committee that I've been able to find where the other party was not allowed to name their own people on the committee. The only Republicans who were on that committee were named by the Speaker of the House. They were not named by the Republican leadership. And so they were people who had already made up their mind about what was going on and what the results of that committee should be. And so once again, people felt that it was not a fair deal that was done that day. So can Americans accept election results today without violence as long as we do the best we can to make sure that we do everything to show that it was on the up and up? And if there are questions, that we raise those questions and allows those questions to be raised. And that completes my presentation. Yeah.
I don't know if this has happened in the past, but the people are evidently being paid to protest. You suppose that changes these are now employees in a way? No.
You have a right to do that. Certainly a lot of the labor people who were getting paid to protest because they need the money anyway. All that does is you say to yourself, if they're not being paid, then they're really motivated. If they are being paid, they might still be motivated, but it helps make it worth their while. In some case, some people get paid because this will help you pay your bail if you get arrested. And sometimes you get arrested for a nonviolent crime. You might be peaceably assembling, but the people who went inside, look, I'll make sure I make this clear. The people who went inside the Capitol building were trespassing. Some of them still have not gone to trial. We have something in this country called habeas corpus. And that doesn't smell right. And if we had a free media, they'd be reporting that. But they haven't been. So, and you should know that. You have the right to know if people are being paid, then say, okay, I can question their motivation if they're being paid.
But that wouldn't change the law.
No, you have the right to protest no matter, whether you're getting paid or not. Yeah, the question was about whether or not some of the people were being paid to protest and whether that should affect it. Any other questions? Other questions? Yeah.
The riot in Washington, D.C. was called insurrection.
Yes.
It's called insurrection for a reason.
Yeah.
And that was if you target people who were involved in insurrection, you link it to a constitution which says limits people who were involved in insurrections leading back to the Civil War.
Okay, let me let the people online know what we're talking about. So the point has been made that the people who were arrested on January 6th were arrested because they said it was an insurrection. I remember there's even some language at one point in time, there's an armed insurrection. There's a movie that's coming out tomorrow. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm looking forward to it, about January 6th, put out by the Babylon Bee, which is normally a satire site, but I got a feeling it's going to be a serious one. I think there are some other ones coming forward. I know that the news agencies have already done, but they have their own motivation. It will be the first insurrection in this country's history where no one was armed. It's also was reported in the beginning and for quite a number of years that certain people were killed. Policeman was killed, somebody was hit with a fire extinguisher. All of that has since been expunged. None of it happened. The only person who died that day in violence was a protester, a woman who was a veteran, who bashed her way into the door and was shot by one of the guards. Now, I'm not going to get into question. I wasn't there, and he may have feared for his life. But all these other things that were part of the narrative that they wanted the people to buy into the fact that this was an insurrection, all turned out to be false. And when you find 4 years later that you're just now finding that out, that makes you question. Now, this is something I say all the time. I'm going to say it here again, and just it's where I am because I study the Bill of Rights so much. So there's only one business. There's only one business in this country that's constitutionally protected. Everybody know what it is? The press. They have a constitutional protection. And they should. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but that's a responsibility. We count on them to call out any side, any actor, any person. If you want to know why I'm feeling kind of riled up right now, when you go home, do an internet search on 60 Minutes and the interview they did with the presidential nominee with the vice president and the controversy that's going on there right now. And I'd be willing to bet 80 to 90% of the American people have no idea what I'm talking about. About the editing that they did. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, she's asking about that. Yeah, exactly. I'm not even going to sit here and try to sum it up for you because I'll come out biased. I know I'm biased. Okay? We all are. We all bring our own bias to things. What you count on is having a diverse media that embraces different viewpoints because their job is to somehow get to the facts. In a society where we choose our representatives to be our government, the worst thing that can happen is not having information because it's kept from you. And now I'm not talking about secrets and classified. I'm talking about out and out, thumb on the scale. And it's always been a problem. That's why I talked about, what was going on in 1800. You had a press that, the press that were favoring Jefferson, and the press that were favoring Hamilton and the Federalists. But it's pretty lopsided right now, and it has been for a while. And we count on them. We count on them to be able to get enough information to make a right decision about our government. And they're failing us miserably. And unfortunately, to some extent, not all of them, intentionally. Yes?
So the next question is, what are your thoughts on how
What you do is you have to start starving them of oxygen. They have to a great extent, our media are all part of big corporations. I sound like some guy, Ayn Rand or something like that. The fact of the matter is, we've never seen it like this before. Most people aren't aware of it. For instance, how many people, does anybody know who owns ABC? Disney. Okay? Does anybody know who owns CBS? CBS is a joint venture now, Paramount, CBS, used to be Time Life. It's changed hands so many times, I don't even know who's running things over there. Okay, all of them are owned by large corporations. And the reason I bring that up is because they don't have to worry about them being profitable anymore. They'd like them to be, but they can use that as a tax write-off. So you used to think, okay, I'm going to not take their advertisers, and I'm not going to watch their shows and all that sort of stuff. They'll still have plenty of people to watch it. They'll still have plenty of advertisers that are advertised there. They're trying to do this to Elon Musk. They're trying to make him get rid of Twitter by putting an advertiser boycott on him and trying to make Twitter, Twitter is unprofitable. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to intimidate the richest man in the world. And somebody said one time, they tweeted not too long ago, said $44 billion that Elon Musk paid for Twitter was the price of free speech. And he retweeted that. He says, yes, that's right. That's what it cost. So it's, my biases are coming out here, I'm telling you right now. But the fact of the matter is that this is really important, that something has to change. I don't have a solution other than at some point in time, they're going to have to pay the price. They're going to have to pay the price. And I was just telling the kids today, I said, the beauty of America is that they decided that we could have a government that we chose, but they could only govern at the consent of the governed. And our rights to free speech and peaceable assembly and petition can say that we can say at times that we do not consent if we find that things are going on that we're not in favor of. And at some point in time, the first thing is organizations like Lafayette Academy, where the kids here, I consider what I do very important to not give a bias. I really work hard to do that. I tell this hand and then the other hand, because it's up to them to have information and knowledge, and then they make their choices. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've got one kid who's not a kid anymore. We had speak to us recently. He was on Fox News several times. And another kid is probably as far left as they go, and he's a legislator up in Washington State. But I treated them the same. They got the same information from me. They make their own decision what they want to do. That's not what's going on in your schools right now. Your schools are indoctrination factories is what they are. And that's why you have these kids that come out and they go up to these people at the protests in Colonial University or something like that, says, what does river to the sea mean? I don't know, but free Palestine. Okay. And you're at Columbia? You're at Harvard? Really? How did you get in here? I don't want to know. Yeah.
So the people that have not been brought to trial for anything they did on January.
They want them to plead guilty.
But they're still in jail.
Yeah.
So the right to a speedy trial
Yeah.
has been.
Well, the right to a speedy trial always depends on the defense. The main reason, and that's a mitigating factor. In other words, when you hear about trials going on for a long time, almost always the judge will give extensions, extenuating circumstances. Will give them an extension because the defense needs it. The state has to be ready. When they charge you and they're ready to go to trial, they have to be ready. If they're not ready, you're supposed to be let go. It's the burdens on the state to have the proof of the case. So if it's taking a while, it's because of the defense. So they look at it and go, well, that's the defense's fault. Yeah, but they're looking at it and saying, look, you're charging me with something I didn't do, and I'm not going to plead guilty. A lot of people did early on. You know, it scared the heck out of them. I understand that. There are fellows going to ruin their lives. People back home were finding out that they were in jail for being involved in this riot. A lot of people's lives got ruined because they followed other people into the Capitol. You ever seen the footage, by the way? They had thousands of hours of footage. Hardly any of it's become public. And the little bit that we see these people calmly walking around in between, you know, the purple ropes on the carpet and look at all the statues and like that. It's not exactly a riot. There's some that deserve to get it. And they threw the book at them, okay? So a lot of people got, some people got convicted just because they were able to tell their cell phone was in the Capitol building.
Some people,
They could tell that your, this is something most people don't know. They can tell where your cell phone is.
They say it doesn't apply when you're studying.
Right. So they could tell some people were in the Capitol building at 1:30 in the afternoon of January 6th, and thus you were trespassing, thus you go to jail. Yeah.
Recently, some folks were putting some Nazi stuff, I guess, on the overpasses and things. Were they trespassing? They're on public property, but
That would probably be, and that's something you're going to look at the local ordinance, or whether that's considered defacing public property or something like that. Now, if they said, we want to have a march and we want to go across this area or something like that, they would probably say, no, you might cause traffic and problems. So they'd say, we can give you this park or this place in front of the police station or something like that.
if you were really right, they should get a permit of some sort. And they would pay, and people who came in behind them when
Right.
they're peaceful of
Right.
might also be violating something.
You oftentimes will find that will be unevenly enforced.
But the Constitution might not protect them because they didn't get the proper permit.
Yes.
And when, let's say it happened in.
But the flip side to that is,
In, Town and Country, where it did happen, if they had an ordinance that said, you can't just, would they be?
right. You have to go and see the authorities and say, we want to protest such and such. What public places can we go to protest? They have to give you a place. Now, they have to do that. You might not like the choices they give you. And if you have a lawyer, a lot of times they'll say, no, we don't want this place, we want that place. Why can't we have that place? Well, we really, no. And what they'll often do is, one of the ways around it is this: you have to put up a $10,000 bond in case something gets damaged. It's the counter reactions they're often more worried about than anything. Someone coming, that's what they were worried about in Skokie, that obviously a lot of the Jewish families in that area would get violent. Completely understandable, but I mean, that's what they were concerned about. So we were trying to think, how can we keep them apart? In the end, the Nazis decided not to march to Skokie, by the way. They went down to Oak Park, a little section of Chicago in the area there, and marched around in some park out there, and there was nobody there. There wasn't even any press, which is really the reason they did the whole thing. They wanted the press, and it was national news. I don't know if anybody here remembers that. I remember it during that time. Yeah.
do you know how many people are being held without?
I don't.
You don't?
I don't.
Is it like in the hundreds?
Yeah, I don't think it's that many anymore, but I know in the hundreds the number of people who were arrested. And again, the difference is you had hundreds of people arrested for that, and whatever people were arrested for trashing DC on Inauguration Day 2017, none of them were held for charges. So, okay, I know that okay, one more and then go ahead.
Yeah, two things. Many of the people involved in solitary, which is unheard of to have solitary confinement for the charges that were made against them
On January 6th.
on January 6th.
They were what now? I'm sorry. Put in solitary. Yes. And the ones that are still there, I understand that every night at the same time they sing the Star Spangled Banner. Jeez.
Can we use the Section 230 as leverage media in terms of fairness?
I'm just going to end that with a question. How many congressmen or senators want to go against the media like that? It's a good way to lose re-election. Okay. All right, long enough.
So just a reminder, tonight is recorded, and so, it is recorded, and so we will put that out, in a week or so, I guess? And there's a plethora of other series in case you missed any of them. We've been doing this for what, 40 years?
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
We've made a slight audible for January's talk.
Oh, yeah.
I've changed, it was originally gonna be the space program. I'm gonna give a report to you on Elon Musk. And I think you're gonna find it really interesting. It's been really a fascinating thing, and not just because of recent week's events. We talked about this before you showed up at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, but I just think the guy's a Renaissance man. He's also a jerk sometimes, but he's fascinating, and he's had a huge impact on the world and this country. So
Which
that's
kind
what
of
I'm gonna do.
dovetails into
It's
your
gonna
talk
do it.
today.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm gonna be doing in January. Elon
When is
Musk.
that? Do you have the date? Do you know?
January 30.
It's the second Thursday, I believe.
So something like the
11th
13th.
Or 13th or something along those lines. It'll be in.
Second
it'll be
Thursday in January.
It's, I think, the second or third Thursday.
So, thank you again.
Oh.
And thank you for everyone being online.
Hey, one more minute.